Spotlight is a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. It seeks to spotlight people, places, and events from around the Diocese of Youngstown that promote the new gospel of joy called for by Pope Francis. Your program host is Father James Korda.
Hello and welcome to Spotlight. I'm Father Jim Korda. Today we're going to talk about nonviolence. And joining me in today's show is Bishop John Michael Botean. Welcome to our show.
Thank you, Father. Good to be here.
You know, it's interesting. You've been on the show many times before, and we've talked about your diocese, the Romanian diocese. We've talked about the Eastern Church. But today we're going to talk about something totally different, and that is nonviolence. Why is it near and dear to your heart?
Well, it goes back to actually a couple of experiences or a couple of factors. One is growing up in this part of Ohio when I did, during the time of the Vietnam War and the ferment at Kent State University. That had an impact on me at the time, but also growing up near larger Amish and Mennonite communities too. So going to school with Amish kids and Mennonite kids, and it was just part of the atmosphere. And so I had a sort of sensitivity to that as I later on entered formation and for the priesthood. And then at a certain point, we had a new spiritual director at the seminary that I was going to, St. Gregory's in Newton Center, Massachusetts, who had been a university professor at the University of Notre Dame and founded the Center for the Study and Practice of Christian Nonviolence at Notre Dame, and then became our spiritual director. He wasn't a priest at the time. He was Charles McCarthy, became Father Emmanuel Charles McCarthy. And after a stop out from the seminary, I went back to the seminary, and one of the first things that happened then was in October, as I recall, was one of his workshops, a weekend retreat, and he put things together in such a systematic and convincing way. I was trained as a lawyer. I made such a good case, but he came also from the experience of Eastern Christianity, which he had become familiar with, and was in fact destined ultimately to become a priest in the Melkite epoch in the United States, a married Melkite priest. And those two things came together, both Byzantine spirituality and Christianity and theology of nonviolence came together in a way that was very, very convincing for me. And I remember writing in my notes, as I was taking notes, I said, this is it, boom, boom, this is it.
Yeah. You know, we do hear about being nonviolence and about peace, and obviously the Church has always been a very loud proponent of that. But why is it important?
I might dispute that.
Okay. Well, we'll talk about that in a moment.
All right.
But why is it such an important issue in this 21st century, in the day and time that we find ourselves?
One of the things that I suppose makes my approach to gospel nonviolence a little bit different from those of others is that I don't take a particularly political tack or approach. Okay. And so other than the simple fact that we have the capacity to destroy the planet slowly or very quickly that we did not have before, I wouldn't say that it's any more pertinent now to the life and salvation of the world than it was when Jesus commissioned his apostles. You know. But in fact, now I think we tend to be a little more sensitive to that, and I pray that what the world is looking for is a way out of the sort of spiritual, psychological mess that it finds itself in. It's manifesting in so many different and destructive ways now, in particular. So. When I talk about gospel nonviolence, there are many ways to talk about nonviolence. Gene Sharp was a practitioner of strategic and tactical nonviolence demonstrations and that kind of thing. Gandhi, of course, was the great proponent of nonviolence, a great success. But I'm talking about the gospel more than anything else when I'm talking about nonviolence. And so when you hear the word nonviolence, you mostly get either a blank stare or non-understanding. People who think they understand it, and they just identify you and rate you off right off the bat as some kind of lefty liberal, hippy-dippy, peacenik, something or other like that. And actually, I had written a letter just before the launching of the Iraq invasion, the Iraq War, opposing it, or basically saying, that in my judgment, that it was not going to be a just war. And who picked up on that more than anybody were a group of people who called themselves paleo-conservatives, because they were, in a sense, from what I understood at the time, there was a doctrine, the just war theory, that was actually being used, rather than manipulated. Now, I'm not a big fan of just war teaching. Does the church teach it? It has taught it. Did Jesus teach it? No, he never said a word about anything like just war. So deciding what to do as a disciple myself, and then later on as a priest, as a preacher, as somebody who tries to evangelize, I want to focus on how it is that Christians can find new life through what I would simply call appropriating Jesus' teachings, or what others might call gospel nonviolence, and how others who are not Christians can find life in the gospel. So evangelization on the one hand, and nonviolence
goes hand in hand.
Go hand in hand for me. Yeah.
We've got about 2 minutes left of our first segment. Nonviolence, when we think of it, we think of putting down arms and weapons and that, but it's bigger than that. It's more than just that, especially if we're talking about the gospel. How can we be nonviolent in our everyday life as Christians?
Oh, yeah, there's so many ways. And I think back to Pope Francis' address to the Congress when he was here, and the three Americans that he picked to focus on, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day, and Father Thomas Merton.
Yes.
They have written, all of them, extensively about how to live a nonviolent life in that larger context.
Right.
Because it is a lifestyle that, first of all, understands that that even though we use the term nonviolence, a sort of privative term starting with non, what we're actually talking about is active love. Active love that responds to human need when it encounters it, and active love that does not distinguish between friend and enemy in loving. And I think that goes to the heart of what Jesus was teaching. So for everyday Christians, it means little by little, enlarging your consciousness and being able through prayer and spiritual discipline to take into consideration all of the ways that the world suffers, and to try to take your baby steps day in and day out to respond to that suffering.
We're going to talk more about that in a moment, Bishop. We're going to take a quick break.
Thank you.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
We are in our 7th year at Cristo Rey Jesuit High School. It arose from the desire of the Jesuits in the Chicago province to serve the Hispanic community here in Chicago. One of the things that's unique about this school is that our kids work 5 days a month at offices in downtown Chicago to pay for their education. That idea originated here. We got telephone calls the first day from the companies thanking us for sending us those kids to their companies. The companies feel good about themselves. 95% of our kids are the first ones in their families to finish high school, and 87% of our graduates are in college right now. This project attracts wonderful, wonderful, enthusiastic, idealistic people. They have to have the desire to kind of reach for the stars. No one believed that it would be as successful as it is. Well, it's obviously caught on, and we're very, very excited about it.
I am Marino.
Yo soy Marino.
Marino, an American Catholic organization of priests and brothers, has been reaching out to those in need for nearly 100 years in 26 countries throughout the world. Missioners, workers, volunteers, supporters, we are all Marino.
I'm Father Mike, and I am Marino.
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 Welcome back to Spotlight. I'm talking with Bishop Botean on nonviolence. Bishop, before we took a break, you were mentioning about when the Holy Father, Pope Francis, was here, in his visit to the United States and spoke very eloquently about three individuals that he really kind of surfaced as hallmarks of nonviolence. Let's briefly, if you could, mention those three again, and what would have really tied them all together? What makes them uniquely nonviolent people?
Mm-hmm. I think even though it's the case mostly for Martin Luther King, but also to a certain extent Thomas Merton, to have studied Gandhi in particular as a point of commonality, what the three of them actually have in common is the gospel. Right. And I think what we see in Martin Luther King is a Christian who's closing the loop. When Gandhi was asked if he considered himself a Christian, and he, by the way, had been converted to nonviolence by reading Leo Tolstoy's The Kingdom of God is Within You. Then when he was asked if he was a Christian, he said, if believing the Sermon on the Mount makes you a Christian, then I'm a Christian. But of course he was never baptized and never practiced Christianity in any recognizable way. And so I think it was Martin Luther King that sort of closed the loop on that. So Gandhi sort of was inspired by the gospel. And he brought Gandhian nonviolence back into the gospel, back into a gospel milieu. And was able to do it as I think God wants it to do, in the sense of empowering people who are oppressed to bring about, nonviolently, major social change. Well, it remains to history to decide the success of that. The struggle continues as it does with all people. Then with Thomas Merton trying to make sense of his life behind walls. Realized that even as a contemplative cloistered monk, his task was to engage the world on the matters of utmost importance. And especially again in the 60s, it was about war. It was about war in particular. Dorothy Day, from her earliest days, had a more comprehensive view, I think, where she was able to incorporate a pacific understanding of peace teaching of nonviolence into the day-to-day life of Christians, as Peter Morin, her co-founder, articulated it in founding and living the Catholic Worker Movement. From that time, I thought that it was those principles in particular that are behind the Catholic Worker that make the most sense to me as far as how to live a Christian life in the world today. Difficult as it is.
And I was going to pick up on that. Why is it, first of all, so difficult for us? If we who call ourselves Christians, want to follow Jesus fully, that's really part of who we are and who he was. But why do we find it so difficult? Is it things around us? Is something inside us? Is it things that are going on in our world and our communities? Why is it so difficult?
I think it's both inside and outside. And a lot of the outside part has to do with a certain kind of reticence on the part of the church, the official church, for a little over a millennium and a half, to bring the teachings, what I would call the teachings of Jesus, to the fore, and to ask the question of Christians as they approach baptism one way or another, to consider very carefully whether Jesus chose to be crucified or whether he simply didn't have the firepower to oppose it. And to make the choice about baptism at that point. But it's also within us because, we want a good life. We want a comfortable life. We want the people that we love to be around us. We want them to be safe. We want to protect them. That's just instinctive. But what I think neuroscience is discovering now is that empathy is just as instinctive. And even though the human species tends to be oriented toward a kind of tribalism, what Jesus is trying to say as the word of God who so loved the world is that this care and this love that we experience in family and tribe and community can be for all people. And that's what I think, and that's why founding a church, founding a community goes to the heart of what Jesus did in his mission. But he founded it On the rock. But the rock was Golgotha.
Right, right. We've got a few minutes left of our middle segment. You know, in the past segment, you had mentioned that Jesus did not really say anything about war in his teachings, and yet he was certainly a loving person to the fullest. But there were things going on around him that obviously were very unsettled. So why do you think he was not speaking out about those wars?
Whether he actually spoke about war in particular, you know, is something that would be lost to history. What we have is the witness of the Gospels, the New Testament witness. And there, the message is to the individual human heart in just about every case. Even in the more dramatic public manifestations of principles, such as the cleansing of the temple, the aim is the conversion of individuals. And so, when he was arrested, you know, on the Mount of Olives, he doesn't say, after Peter draws his sword, he doesn't say, well, we're going to take a principled position of nonviolence here and resist the overwhelming power of the Roman army. No, no, no. He said, put away the sword. Right. And Tertullian says, when Jesus disarmed Peter, he disarmed every Christian. And I think that's how the early Christians understood it.
Sure. Well, you know, that disarming, as difficult as it is at times, is really kind of like the first step to understanding what nonviolence is in our own lives, in our own existence.
Sure, but it's also the final step, because it's what the whole practice of Christian asceticism is aimed at being able, in a crisis moment, to do without the protection of violence and to trust God absolutely, as Jesus trusted his Father. And that might be the first step, but you spend your whole life working at it.
That's true.
You really do. It's not an easy thing.
We're going to take another break, Bishop. We'll be back in a moment. Stay with us.
There is a place where a total stranger will give you their blood. There is a place where someone you never knew will save your child from drowning. A place where people from 7 states away will turn up at your door and give you food and shelter after a flood. There's a place where a person who doesn't look like you, talk like you, or dress like you will stretch out their hand and put it across your shoulders and say, everything is going to be okay. That place is called America, where we look out for each other, and it's up to us to keep it that way. When you help the American Red Cross, you help America.
What have you done for your marriage today?
I gave my wife a hug this morning. I told her I love her. Instead of sitting on the couch, I helped to clean up.
I cooked my husband's favorite breakfast.
I sent my husband a love email.
What have I done for my marriage today? It's a good question.
I gave her a call and say, thinking of her. And the kids.
I did her hair this morning. I think it looks pretty good.
We're going to the museums as a family.
What have I done for my marriage today?
I made my wife coffee and breakfast this morning.
It's going to be her birthday next week, so I've been spending time today making arrangements to make that extra special.
Oh, we're spending the day together?
I bought her an orchid.
Hassan was able to let me sleep in by taking care of him in the morning.
I read the newspaper to my wife, and it cracked her up. She's still laughing.
What have you done for your marriage today? Small changes can make a world of difference. Get started at foryourmarriage.org, a message from the Catholic Church.
Well, I've been volunteering for 18, almost 20 years for volunteer chore service for Catholic community services. What I do is help the elderly in their homes so that they can stay in their homes. I do work from shopping to housework to yard work. Most of the people I see don't really have a lot of family, so then I become almost like their family.
I think a lot of times the elderly in our society are forgotten, and that's unfortunate because they're a real important part of our community because they have so much wisdom to share.
Doing this type of work is very rewarding. You can't put it into words because I learned so much from these people, and you learn stuff about yourself too. You learn to see God in a variety of people, in a variety of settings. The other day she told me that every night when she goes to bed, she thinks about her little angel, when her little angel's going to come and check on her the next day. And that's me, yeah.
33 million Americans have descended into poverty. And as their futures fall, so does our nation's.
Welcome back to our show. I'm talking with Bishop Botean on nonviolence. Bishop, I think in our first segment, I made the statement about the church always talking about peace and nonviolence, but that fortunately is not always part of our history. Tell us a little bit about the history of the church in regards to peace and war and nonviolence.
It seems to me, and sometimes I get a little bit confused about some of the historical details, but from what I understand, the church went from a ragtag group of Jewish sectarians to a worldwide movement in about 300 years, such to the extent that it was able to challenge the greatest power the world had ever seen at that point. And so that the Emperor Constantine, like it or not, had to reckon with Christianity. And a couple centuries of persecution, on and off, prosecuted with inconsistent severity. Didn't succeed in wiping out the movement, but in fact it grew as it probably never has since. And so, at a certain point, Constantine, who my church recognizes as a saint, May 21st, is Saints Constantine and Helen, he and his mother, he killed his father, so the father's not in there, was in all likelihood baptized on his deathbed, in which case our teaching is he went straight to heaven, and that would make him a saint, right? Sure. But the church was also ready to be in power, and the church was ready to just let go of the whole persecution business, because little by little Christians had been working their way quite naturally into society. So what happened was, in tolerating Christianity, the next step that the Emperor Constantine took was to take some pagan temples, expropriate them, and give them to Christians as places of worship. Exactly what the communists did to my church in the 40s in Romania. Take from this group of religious group and give the other. So to a certain extent, it was about real estate, because if you were going to have property, then you needed the power of the state, the violent power of the state, to defend it. Right? And things, to my mind, kind of went down from there. From my understanding, and again, I may be wrong, but my understanding is that Ambrose of Milan, at a time when Milan was to Rome what New York is to Washington, St. Ambrose was from the most prominent family in Milan, and went from being the pagan dictator of Milan to its bishop in about 8 days. So was the first to articulate a just war theory, and a just war theory actually comes from pagan Stoic philosophy. Sure. And it's all about trying to moderate and the brutality of war for the sake of people who are practicing war, for the sake of the state. And so the just war theory has always been a theory for the state, not one particularly for the individual Christians. Ambrose's student Augustine then developed the most famous articulation of it. Later on, St. Thomas Aquinas made participation in war a means of grace. Earlier than that, the Synod of Arles specified that priests had to use clubs, I believe, not spears and swords, in battle. And ultimately, then they came to the Crusades, where until the Portiuncula indulgence of St. Francis Assisi, the only way to get a plenary indulgence, which is a big part of the spiritual economy and the economic spirituality of its day, was by participating in the Crusades, or paying somebody else to participate in the Crusades. And so plenary indulgence made you go straight to heaven if you die in war, which has now come back to haunt Christians in teachings of a kind of Islam yeah, I'm not Muslim, so I'm not qualified to say what is Islam and what is not. But at least one group of Muslims who say that that their martyrs are going straight to heaven, you know. And so they were not the first. They were the object of that kind of teaching originally. And so Christian just war teaching has gone through many different kinds of. One thing that never seemed to happen to it was no Christian church or hierarchy in particular ever used that teaching in opposing its own country's wars. But the most I guess flagrant example of it's actually being put into practice is the Blessed Franz Jägerstätter. If you've heard about him, he was somebody who actually, as a peasant in Austria, not exactly a world-class Catholic in terms of his piety and that kind of thing, known as a sort of party guy, but eventually became more involved in his faith and studied the principles of just war theory and came to the conclusion that many others came to after the fact, that Hitler was not pursuing a just war as Christian just war teaching. And so therefore, he couldn't participate in it. And therefore, he was beheaded for his refusal to join the army, Hitler's army, and to participate in the war. Now I think I'm praying that the church is kind of rediscovering its evangelical roots and realizing that the teaching of Jesus, when teaching, commissioned the apostles to go out and teach all that I have commanded you, not some of what I've commanded you, is valid, and that what one needs to focus on, what the church needs to focus on, is, I think, again, the witness of the teaching of Jesus in the Gospels in the New Testament. And scripture scholar John L. Mackenzie from back in the day was very, very explicit about this kind of thing, and I found that some of his writings have been very, very helpful in terms of dealing with the problem of authority in the church, the problem of violence in the church, the state and violence, and approaching them from the point of view of New Testament exegesis. It's very, very, very helpful, I think. And so I'd refer anybody to The Power and the Wisdom, Church and Authority, and a couple of his other works for a fuller understanding of this.
Well, Bishop Botean, it's been a pleasure to have you on Spotlight. We certainly appreciate you highlighting this tremendous issue of nonviolence, this issue that really affects a lot of us, and all of us, in particular those of us who follow Jesus. And so we thank you for that. And God bless you in your polity, and also in you bringing about the kingdom of God.
Oh, you too. And thank you for this opportunity to preach a little bit.
You're welcome. Thank you. And thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Spotlight has been a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program host was Father James Korda.